Hi everyone, welcome to a new SenseAbility edition. This month we will be talking about music and Feldenkrais and the crossover between the two and where the Feldenkrais method can be useful to musicians across the world. Today my guest is Erin Finkelstein. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Uh, she is a lifelong musician. She studied piano when she was a child, and when she was 14, was told that during a piano performance or afterwards by one of her teachers, that if she continued playing the piano in the way she was, that was going to lead to serious injury, or serious postural issue. So from that point, the use of her body has been something that she's often thought about. And then later on, she studied at Arizona State University, did a master's, I think, in clarinet performance. And during that course, she actually became aware of the Feldenkrais method, and from there has trained in it. And that was over 17 years ago. So I'm really happy to have you on today, Erin. Welcome to SenseAbility podcast slash interview. Um, if I missed something there, maybe you want to add a little bit of information on top of that, just to introduce yourself.
Sure. So I have a practice in Phoenix, Arizona, where I work with musicians, elderly, but a very large population of children now. And there's quite a crossover, ironically, I think, between working with kids and being a musician, because it's really all about listening, and deep listening, which musicians are really good at. Um, and and I think that we as Feldenkrais practitioners have a lot to offer musicians in terms of this ability to listen in a deeper way, or listen to the actual instrument of your own nervous system, not just the sounds you're producing. So, yeah, the work has been along my whole journey of my professional life, as a musician, and I'm just very thankful that I found it, and I hope we can talk about how more people can find it.
Good. Yeah. Well, I mean, just to follow up on what you just mentioned about listening, then I'm not a musician. I would make an assumption that listening would be a skill that you would develop very naturally as a musician. Um, of course, when I say that, I'm thinking about the audible listening quality. I assume that you're talking about something slightly different. So I don't know if you want to kind of like go into that in a bit more detail or really highlight what you mean by listening.
Sure. So in the Feldenkrais world, we talk about having coordinated action, right? Any action that is in a coordinated, easy fashion, whether it's brushing your teeth or playing an instrument, is a combination of thinking, sensing, moving, and feeling. And we talk about feeling being a little bit more of the emotional state, and sensing being, well, all of your senses. So oftentimes with musicians, when you think about the bubble within your senses, you have taste, sight, hearing, smell, and all of the things. And we're very, very focused within the sensing part of what I call the action pie: thinking, sensing, moving, feeling. We're very focused on that listening, and that listening outward, because we're all constantly producing a sound that then disappears, right? The nature of sound is that it's there and then it's not there. So all that to say, in the development of music education and how we go through school from childhood, from very early on to all the way through college, sometimes what happens is, or it happened for me, and I see it happen with a lot of my colleagues, is that we get so focused on the outward listening that what I think the Feldenkrais work can offer music education and performers and musicians of all walks of life is the ability to turn that sensing or listening inward
Mhm.
to your own organization of your skeleton, your musculature, your inner ability to listen to your own thoughts and your own presence while you're playing.
Mhm.
But it's this general concept of actually taking that incredible capacity to listen outwardly to others and analyze sound in that way and turn that inward to make, I think, music much more vibrant. We have this problem, quote unquote, in classical music that everybody says it's dying, nobody comes to concerts anymore. And that's been a lifelong, hundreds of years, issue for classical music. But I think this actual consideration of where are you actually playing from is incredibly useful for the vitality of our own profession as musicians and for our own health and wellness as musicians. So maybe we should talk a little bit more about what that means. I'll never forget working with somebody on my table, my Feldenkrais table, and a very, very literal, wonderful man. We're good friends now. And I was moving him and saying, I used the word listen in a way. I said, listen to how this moves. And he sat right up off the table and he said, do you actually hear something? And I thought that is so interesting because he was taking that word listening as just literal sounds through the ear. But as Feldenkrais practitioners, we use the quality of our movement, the relative ease of our movement and our intention as what we're listening to. So it's a different idea to turn the mirror inward in order to affect the sound that's coming outward, if that makes sense.
It does. It poses some questions in my head, at least. One is, do you think that impacts the way people perceive the music that you play? So do you think that like if someone's really in tune with themselves and they're listening to themselves as they perform, that makes a difference in the actual performance, like in the quality of the music that's being played? Maybe that's a good initial question.
I think so. In my opinion, yes. I mean, when I watch someone, there are, virtuosos on every instrument, right? And there's oftentimes where I'll listen to someone and I'll be very impressed. That is incredible technique. Wow, that's just, look at what they can do. But when there's a quality of embodiment, what do I mean by that? When there's a quality of intimacy with one's own self, one's own organization, it seems to me that something else radiates from that that's more enticing and more moving on the emotional spectrum, not just the technical spectrum. And I think that's something that gets a little bit lost in our modern day music education. I think in part because, we live in a very technical world. We're on devices all day long. Our instruments are a kind of device. And when we're going through music education we have to develop all the technique in order to do that. But what I think Feldenkrais does is it gives a language to something that's almost hard to quote language into. And Feldenkrais talks about this, right? That sometimes words just don't capture what we're going for. But when you go to see a musical performance that wows you beyond what their technique is, but that there's something innately, I mean, as a musician, I guess we would quote unquote call it musical. I don't really even love that word. It's a quality of presence that comes through. That to me says that person has a connection with their self-organization that sometimes people just have, right? People just have this capacity to be with themselves in a way that just radiates a love of what they're doing. It radiates a kind of presence. It radiates a kind of something that draws you in a way that others might not in the same emotional capacity.
Mm.
And I think that a lot of times we label that as talent, right? Especially, anybody can look at a musician and say, oh, they're so talented. But every musician had to learn this. This is a skill that we've been developing since we were children, since before we knew how to count. This is something that many of us started when we were single digits on Earth, right? So the idea of talent doesn't really resonate. But when you see somebody who has maybe just this kind of presence to what they're doing, that to me is maybe more where we can talk about talent. And what is it though, really? Maybe it's just this quality in that person's nervous system that just didn't have as much static growing up, or they learned through a method like this or Alexander or something, how to create that sense of ease in themselves. Because I think it's that self-organization that we can find that creates a lightness and creates an energy or something. I know people are a little allergic to that word energy in the Feldenkrais world, but there's something in music that is energetic that draws in the audience in a different way when you have this kind of openness. And I think for myself, in my training program with Russell Dillman, it was Julie Peck came in, was one of our trainers at that time, and there was a moment when we just were working with this tiny, tiny movement of bringing the lower ribs forward. And for me, that teeny tiny bit of information was so revealing. It was so eye-opening. It was so inspiring that it gave me this missing link to playing with more ease, playing with more freedom. And for me, it was just this little tiny blind spot that I had no idea I could move ever so slightly and everything would become a little bit easier. So is talent learned, or is it actually something is a result of a lot of training of all these different aspects?
Okay, so I've like three thoughts on the back of the stuff that you've just talked about. One is that I think that we should address this subject of ease and how you get there. Two, you're talking about talent, so I'd kind of like to cover that off. But first, my first thought was kind of going back a step, that you mentioned this sort of like sensing process and listening. And on the other side, as the listener to the musical piece, that is something that you receive, and you receive it into yourself. So if you're listening to a musical piece or, like someone performing, the process comes in and the reaction to it is a felt reaction, kind of going back through those steps of feeling and sensing. So it's like kind of going back, like you feel something and that provokes some emotional reaction, So it's interesting how that's the other side of that process, that as the listener to a musical piece, it's better for you if you're listening to yourself, because you'll feel it more. Whereas as the performer, you're not necessarily thinking, I need to listen to myself as I play to improve the performance, You're just thinking, or maybe you're trained to use your instrument well or have good technique, but I don't know necessarily if you're trained through your musical training to actually listen to yourself as you play.
That's such a great topic. And it's true. We're not trained to listen to ourselves in the way that we are in the Feldenkrais work. And so I'm going to take what you said and take it like a full circle a little bit. So when we come through our musical education and we're teenagers, we're very emotional. We're teenagers. Teenagers are by nature, their emotional brains are developing, and there's a lot of emotion. So for me, when I was in high school, music was everything for me. It's how I felt well. It's how I felt connected. It was just such a enriching experience. When I got through college, you have to temper a lot of that in order to get better, because you need more intellectual information about your instrument, history, theory. You're just really filling that prefrontal cortex with information. And so I think what happens in that, so you've got the emotional piece and then the thinking piece. When the thinking piece becomes really developed, somewhere in there, and when we're really young, how did we start? It didn't even sound good, right? And so why did we start? Well, we sensed ourselves differently because of the sound. So before we even got to the point of like it was an emotional experience, it was just about this sort of moving differently and sensing and just making sound. So I think like we go through these places, but in that, what I think a lot of people miss, and I missed for a long time, was this capacity to sort of blend all of them together. And that to me is where the Feldenkrais method has this unbelievable container to be able to just slow down and move in such a way that you are still an independent person from all of this development musically. Because a little bit what happens sometimes, or maybe all the time, is that musicians' self-image becomes so entangled, entwined with who they are as a musician that there's no separation. So in that critical time when you're developing in your 20s, most of us are so entwined in being a musician. And I'm speaking from myself. I was the most entwined. I did not have a self-image outside of being a musician. I did not want a self-image outside of being a musician. I did not value it. I did not care about it until I had an injury. And it forced me to actually look at myself as a human, separate from myself as a musician. Because again, when you start learning something this neurologically complex, which, Moshe said this, right? Moshe said this, that musicians are some of the most intelligent people he worked with, because musicians have to use all parts of their brain at the same time to do this really complicated thing. But when you start that so young, it's just a piece, it just becomes, for many of us, especially if you have any trauma, and music for a lot of people is a place to escape into. And so when you have that as like a piece that just develops right along with you, I think it can get very complicated at some point when you have to discover that you're someone else also besides that. That's what the method, one of the things that it helped me with, is develop that sense of self. And it's for those of you who haven't done awareness through movement yet, I didn't understand what I was doing in awareness through movement for months. I would take this class at ASU with Rich Goldstand 20 years ago, and I would go into these classes completely depressed, if I was really honest with myself. And then I would hardly move at all. These little not knowing what was happening, get off the floor 45 minutes later and feel not depressed. And that to me started a process of differentiating myself from my instrument and being able to play much better and with much more satisfaction, because I wasn't being the music. I wasn't being that. And for me, having that container of learning how to take the sound inward and start to actually sense anything that existed below my head was revolutionary for me. I mean, it was life-changing. So
it's really interesting. No, I mean, like, you've kind of gone into the second question that I wanted to raise, which was, you talked about, like, I don't know, the wording you use, like I think you said virtuoso, which is like peak, let's say peak musical performance. And in that peak musical performance, like maybe other fields, you would call that mastery. But Moshe Feldenkrais talked about it in terms of potency. And that, a person's like fulfilling their ability as a human being. You know, they're living up to their full potential, let's say. And I think within the context of what you're saying, like what was required for you was a step of separation from the image of a musician to feel the potency of your own self distinct from being a musician, and then you could come back into that contact with being a musician in a different way, right? That's how
Absolutely.
that's how it sounds to me.
100%. And, I had to reconcile that no matter how hard I tried or used my willpower. I mean, if somebody, I did this, was taught, early on, you need to practice 4 hours a day every day. And man, if somebody told me to do that, I practiced 5 hours a day, and then got to a point where there was no return happening. In fact, it was getting worse.
Yeah.
And I had to really reconcile with that. And I had to, and it was tricky. It was very hard because other people were doing it too. It was a very competitive environment, but something in me wasn't working. I wasn't home for it anymore. Emotionally, physically, I don't know, right? Whatever you want to call. I mean, some people will go into the spiritual realm, and that's just your language. That's just your container of whatever language you use around that. But for me, it just was like I lost how to be home inside of myself, separate from it. And so it was like right after my master's program, I started my training program that summer with Russell Delman. And I asked him, I said, what should I be playing? I mean, I can't even fathom stopping right now, even though I was inside. It was just like, I just couldn't get my love for it. It was just, I was finding it in these weird movements on the floor. But then when I would get up off the floor, I would go back in my habitual way of functioning. Right. So once I started the training program, he said, don't play. And if I hadn't felt so bad in myself, I think I wouldn't have been able to do that. But I really, truly put the clarinet away for 2 months, right after I got my master's in it. And I was going to New York City to study a little bit more. And so it even was more of a conflict for me. Yeah. But that just tells you how kind of bottomed out I was emotionally. And I'll tell you, after doing 2 months of Feldenkrais and exploring and doing all of these, I mean, just the self-discovery that happened through that training program was the best thing that ever happened to me as a person and as a musician, because at the end of it, when I went to pick up and play again, or some point towards the end, I had this sensation of freedom that, yes, maybe the musculature had changed a little bit. Obviously, I didn't have the stamina that I had, but the freedom that I had within myself, I just remember this so distinctly, feeling I could go in an audition right now. It was the clearest I'd ever been. And I don't think that I've ever been that clear since. It's always, that play, real life. And if you haven't done a Feldenkrais training program, we can both tell you that you're so immersed in the access of neuroplasticity in your own brain that you just have so much freedom to figure out, I could go here, I could do this, anything is possible, right? Because you're kind of wiping your slate clean for a little bit, so you have more options. So that was just such a distinct, defining moment in my musical career, to realize that, there is a time and a place to practice 4 hours a day, or 3 or 2.5, or the questions becomes, what do you do in that practice time? How are you organizing yourself? How much of that time is accessing your own neuroplasticity and imagination, which we hardly ever talk about in our music education. But as a practitioner, that when you teach a one-sided lesson to a group of students for half an hour, then you imagine the other side for maybe 8 minutes. All of a sudden, you can do the other side. So I like to bring that into any student that I'm working with as well. That yes, you can practice for 4 hours in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to be constantly on the horn for 4 hours, causing that sort of tissue wear and tear, especially as we age, right?
So just like a follow-up question. I mean, one comment. I like my first question is like, did that change how you enjoy? Like, did it bring joy back to playing the clarinet again?
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and a follow-up to that is last month we talked a lot about play, and
Mhm.
kind of listening to you talk, it makes me think that, we use the word play for playing an instrument, but often the process is 4 hours of very mechanical training that I think loses the quality of play. Or I would say, I don't know, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but it sounds like it loses the quality of play, and that in some way the kind of competitive um arena, where it's like, it's a professional thing, you need to earn money, you're up against people that are, maybe more naturally talented at the thing, so you need to put in more work. I wonder through the mechanical I mean, even when you talked about putting the clarinet down for a bit, like it's very clear that there's a sense of like, I should be practicing for 5 hours a day, or I feel guilty because someone else is going to be doing it more, or I'm not going to be good enough because you've been in this sort of like, I don't know,
Yeah.
in this soup. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's very complicated. There's the economic piece. I think that for me that was very important to like prove that I could do it, because we're taught that, very few can make it economically. And so, that's I think another thing to talk about. That's like sort of another strain of, you know, this idea of self-image and being able to do more than one thing at a really high level. And most of us who go into music school, like we want to play at a high level. Um, and we appreciate all people who love music, who are amateurs. My husband's an amateur musician, and and so there's a great appreciation, obviously, but there's a moment where you're trying to separate yourself from that, and you're trying to rise above that. But I think the other thing about play is that there is a moment where you have to use play to sort of embody whatever character you're trying to find, and sometimes our music is really not playful, right? And so how do you kind of get into the headspace of this moment in this Brahms symphony or this, and so you're kind of having to be an internal actor as well, that you can't really see in a way, right? When somebody's on stage and they're acting a certain way, and it's very clear how the Feldenkrais method can help that. But for me, it's like when you don't quite have that like emotional freedom or that center or that lightness or that quality we're talking about of effortlessness, then it's harder to shift internally to be in the moment of this character and then this character, because it doesn't happen on your face in the same way unless you're a singer. I mean, I don't have my clarinet with me right now, but I'm in a stuck position. There's like only so much I can do to like emote something. Obviously you can, but it's also just an internal shift. So this idea of play as a core value is really important to just, I think, keep in there so that you can access all these other emotional qualities. And I think what happens sometimes is people, they go into music school, they love it, and then this thing happens, this breakdown happens. Then there's, I've worked with a lot of adults who are amateurs, and there's just this real conflict inside of themselves, a striving to be better, because they're trying to access those great feelings that they had before, that they got diminished through this sort of academic process, which again, I'm not saying that we should change that. In fact, like, there's a lot of like movements to like, oh, should we really be, teaching Bach anymore in music school? And I'm like, yes, we should, so I'm not to throw a baby out with the bathwater, but I think that this dynamicism can really help just bring the whole person along the way. And it doesn't have to be as scripted as we think. Musicians, classical musicians especially, we want to know what we're doing. And oftentimes when I'm first working with a musician who's coming to me with an injury and I give them awareness through movement lesson, I will tell you 9 times out of 10, they say, well, I'm just not very good at this. I'm just not very good at this. And that was my feeling of thinking too. It's so interesting because other populations that I work with don't say those words, right? And there's this idea that like we know how to move our body. I know how to do this. Oh well, I just can't do this. I'm not very good at this. So there's something about learning how to use the whole skeleton more effectively so that the small muscles can work better. We talk about like that we're the athletes of the small muscle groups, and we hardly ever in music school talk about the organization of the skeleton at all. So I think that you don't have to know how you're going to get there, but this container that Feldenkrais figured out is so freeing. It's just so freeing. Sorry, I went on a tangent there. Good
It's
at
great.
that.
It's great. Maybe you could just say a little bit about what the Feldenkrais method is. I mean, people, I assume, if they're watching this, they have some background, but maybe they don't. Maybe they're a musician that is looking for some kind of help with how they play, whether that's improving performance or feeling better about themselves, but like starting to enjoy it again, or dealing with an injury, like looking at you talked about your like, the image you have of yourself.
Yeah.
Maybe it could be like a variety of people coming in. Maybe you could explain a little bit the
Yeah.
process of Feldenkrais and how it helped you or how it relates to being a musician. That would be great.
Sure. Yeah. So for me, the Feldenkrais method at its core is a learning modality. And in the music world, we get a lot of questions like, oh, is it like Alexander technique? Well, yes and no. And it's not just like a set of movements that you learn how to do. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of moving with attention and awareness. It's a way of shifting your own mind. It's a container for you to restore your nervous system, to find a better balance between your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. It's a way to move with easier movement, but also it's a way to age with your instrument in a healthy, graceful way. So for me, the Feldenkrais method is a way of thinking. It is a learning modality. But to bring it to musicians a little more specifically, it's a way of learning how to play your instrument, the instrument that's you, so that you can play your instrument better. And singers understand that probably in a different way than instrumentalists do, because they literally are their own instrument, right? But I think as instrumentalists, we need this container to learn how to access. It's actually lowering your brainstem, right? It's not this cognitive work that we do in learning theory and history. It is accessing the part of your brain where you learned how to move your fingers on your instrument long ago, but then applying it to the whole aging nervous system, skeletal muscular system as you go through life as a musician. Does that make sense? Is that helpful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder like I think that sets the stage, but what do you actually do in a Feldenkrais lesson? You know?
Yes, what do you do? So there are two ways that the Feldenkrais method is is experienced. Awareness through movement are group classes that are verbally guided. And so this is, to me, sort of the repertoire, right? This is the meat and potatoes. This is your Brahms, your Berlioz, your Mozart. And these experiences are containers for you to discover a few things. Variations in movement that you can't come up with on your own because you are living in your own nervous system with your own habitual orientation to everything. So every movement you make is your own personal habitual movements. Even if you're playing the same instrument as someone else, you still have your own habitual things that are happening that you're not aware of. So awareness through movement gives you a container to discover your blind spots, and you discover them through sensing them. And that's coming back to that idea of listening to yourself, but you're listening through movement, because movement is the language of the brain. And it's really the language of music as well. We just think of it, it's not visual, it's audible. So that's how I think of awareness through movement for musicians, right? That's a verbally guided experiences in movement that give you a much, much, much slower pace to then be able to perceive differences. So we talk about this in the Weber-Fechner principle, that there's this idea that you can only perceive so much if your stimuli is really great. And stimuli is really great in musicians all the time. We're around too much sound all the time. So awareness through movement de-stimulates your nervous system so you can sense a blind spot. So that's how I would kind of describe awareness through movement. Now, the lessons are going to look like you rolling on the floor. Maybe you won't see anything. Maybe it's all a breathing lesson, but Feldenkrais left an incredible body of work, over 500 pieces, we would say, to use a musical term, to create any possibility of finding a blind spot to discover, sense, and then integrate into how you use it within yourself. Functional integration is the hands-on version. Yeah.
Before you go to functional integration, can I just add that, the lesson, the awareness through movement lessons, then it's not something that you're doing with your instrument in your hand. You're lying with yourself as you're talking about experiencing your own body instrument, trying movement on a mat or in standing or in sitting, trying variations of movement, and that can inform how your self-use. Did we cover self-use at all?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think we can cover it a little bit more, but yes, I agree. When I talk to musicians, I think of it this way, like it's a theme and variations, right? So you're going into a class, you don't know what you're going to get necessarily. Maybe it seems like, oh, okay, we're doing a lesson somehow that has something to do with coming up to sit. Well, I know how to come up to sit, but do you know how to do it in these 14 different ways that are incredibly satisfying and feel great when you slow down and make you laugh and it's funny and it's joyful, right? And so yes, that idea of theme and variation, so that then when you go back to play your instrument, you are different. Your nervous system and the embodiment of your nervous system in your skeleton is different.
Yeah.
So one place we get stuck with musicians is we think about it. I want to think about relaxing my left shoulder. Okay, I'm going to force that. And so what this does is it takes the thinking out of it, and you do it purely through experience over and over and over. The new experience then wires. So that's where it's very similar to practicing an instrument, because you do it over and over and over, you create a habit, and then all of a sudden you can play that piece. So if I want to learn how to sit here all day long very comfortably, I'm actually going to do that by doing awareness and movement on the floor, slowing things down, experiencing parts of myself that I don't feel when I'm in standing or sitting, come back and feel, oh, that's so much different. That's so much easier. And so I do this all the time. If I get stuck when I'm practicing, I do not just keep hammering it. Put my clarinet down, I lay on the floor. I experience something, an awareness through movement, or just my own version of it in that moment. If I need 5 minutes, I come back to my clarinet, and my concentration's better, my thinking is clearer, everything's better. So
That's great.
laying on
Yeah.
the
Yeah. I was going to ask, like, do you think that I would use the word like a learning philosophy, right? Feldenkrais to me is a learning philosophy.
Mhm.
We think of learning in a specific way, but Feldenkrais teaches it in a way that's very much you are you are the thing that's learning, you know. You are what's learning is. And then what it sounds to me like you're then bringing that back into the learning process of learning an instrument or playing or practicing an instrument, which has like let's say you're learning a new piece of music. It's not necessarily the beginning of your learning process, but each time you pick up a new sheet of, like, you know, you've got a new performance, you need to learn that piece, right? So it sounds to me like you're taking the philosophy of the Feldenkrais method, which is an approach to learning, and then bringing it into how you engage with yourself in the learning process of the instrument as well, which to me seems like something that is a very like beneficial thing for all musicians to try, at least, you know.
Yeah, and I would suggest trying it before you have an injury, because that's oftentimes when people find the Feldenkrais method is they've gotten an injury, and then they have an audition coming up that, you know, for practitioners who don't know, who aren't musicians, you know, this is important to know. When a classical musician comes into your office and they have an audition in 2 weeks in Boston, and they've bought a plane ticket to get there and a hotel room to get there, and they've taken off work to get there, and there will be 200 people plus there for that one job, and it's behind a screen. It is the most high pressure situation, and yet 200, 300 people are showing up to do it. You have to really take into consideration how much change you should impose upon that nervous system before that audition, because that happens all the time. People come into me, I have an audition, and all of a sudden I can't use my right arm. And talk about a collapse of a self-image, right? So it's quite important as practitioners, anybody who's listening, to know the container in which you're working in, right? It's different than if somebody comes in and says, you know, I'm an amateur guitarist, I just love this so much, and I'm really having a problem with my right arm. With them, you almost have a better opportunity to have a longer scope of what needs to happen and change in that system. For the person who's in this pressure cooker, you're going to give them the experience of just feeling okay for an hour and a few tools to connect to their breath, to get through the experience, to then start rebuilding that self-image and that nervous system after the audition. I can't stress that enough, because I think we don't understand the container that people are coming in with. There's a lot of different types of musicians that come to Feldenkrais Practitioner. So from the classical music perspective, you know, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We just have to help that person in that moment get to the place that they need to be, to then start to really reorganize around that whole experience.
Yeah, because I guess because change is disruptive, you know, and if you've learned a specific way and you need to get through your exam or your, you know, performance, you don't want to disrupt. You know.
You don't want to take all the habits away in that moment. You know, you want to create comfort and safety, and create a little bit of an opening of curiosity to then come back, because it takes a lot of courage to either courage or desperation, I think, to make this kind of change within yourself as a musician. There's not a lot of clarity or charted territory. And in part, it's just the way music has been taught by rote, or, you know, following a lineage of a teacher. And so this way of thinking, it takes longer, but it's more satisfying. And so it takes a lot of courage to be able to really look at that and take that amount of time that it takes to rearrange that, because it's a change in your whole way of thinking for the rest of your life.
But there's a massive payoff at the end of it, right?
Yeah, happiness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like, you know, anybody who knew me in my early 20s would not recognize me today. You know, but I think it comes through in everything that I do now, right? And I have a repertoire of ways to sort of work with my own neuroplasticity when I get stuck or depressed, or, you know, it just gives you a greater repertoire for anything you want to do during your time here on Earth, whether that's you want to put the instrument away for 6 to 8 months. And look, we all had this experience, and I think it's worth saying this out loud. We all learned what it's like to stop playing our instruments quite recently during the pandemic, right? A lot of us tried to keep playing, and then some people played all the way through. You know, some people got really great at their technology, you know, but when the container of your entire existence vanishes overnight, and you don't know if it's coming back because it involves an aging population sitting close together, right? Classical musicians had a very, very hard time during the pandemic mentally. And many of us just stopped playing at some point for an amount of time. Prior to the pandemic, the mindset was hamster wheel, whoever's trying hardest, whoever's going fastest, you know, yes to every gig. Yes, I'm overwhelmed and overstimulated, but at least here in America, you know, a grain of salt. But, you know, it's a very, very busy life when you get to a point where you're an actual practicing musician for a living. When that went away, I think all of us discovered when it was over that you can actually take 2 months off of playing and get back. It was like a massive, to me, ATM lesson for the classical world to realize that you can stop playing for an amount of time, and actually your nervous system, depending on where you are, I'm not talking about people who are still learning, I'm talking about, you know, 22 and above, that there is a point in time where, yes, you have to build back certain things, but that building back, you actually know how to do. And prior to the pandemic, nobody would give themselves that. We would never talk about this out loud, taking any time off, you know, we would never say that. Our egos would not, we would never say that out loud as a profession, right? Now I'm very open about it now, that there are chunks of time that I don't play nearly as much as I did pre-pandemic, and I like my playing better now. So it's almost like a cultural habit of thinking, especially as we age. You know, we don't have any repertoire of language around aging as we are playing as we age. You know, how do you actually age successfully? Do you really need to keep pounding yourself? Or is there a way that you can access your neuroplasticity, just like we did in the pandemic, to then be able to come back? Because I'm telling you, not every orchestral musician played, you know, 10 hours a week like they did every week during the pandemic. It was a long chunk of time, you know, 12 months or more with no live concerts. Never before in history, you know, well, that's not true. In our lifetime, that has never happened. So I just bring that up as a reminder to everyone, because I can feel us being pulled back to our old habits a little bit.
No, I think it's really important to state, and it, you know, it makes me think that in some way what you're doing in a Feldenkrais awareness through movement lesson is like a mini version of that space. It's like you're having a little break, checking in with yourself, trying
Mhm.
some variations that you're not familiar with, exploring, learning, you know, surprising yourself. And then when you've
Exactly.
had a break and you come back to something, the quality is very well, like you're going to enjoy it more, like.
Yes, and I think the audiences as well, right? So whatever wires together, fires together, that saying. And as musicians, I think if we don't take breaks, the neural map gets too, what's the word I'm looking for? Too monotonous, too the same, too habitual. So
Mm,
it's we need more breaks in order to gain more experiences to then express about, to then tap into, to then
mm,
mm, have more of a creativity around even the constructs of a classical performance where you're not exactly creating, you're not composing yourself. It's not like a jazz situation. But
mm,
I think we can bring in elements of that creativity into the neural map of your own playing through taking not even a lot of time, but just taking some time to literally move differently so that
mm,
your brain has more information when you go back to the thing that you've been doing since you were 5.
mm. Just because it occurs to me, I was reading a book at some point that was kind of like anti-productivity in some way. And the one of the kind of facts within it was that the brain needs downtime because that's when it gets rid of all of the useless information. And so if
Mm-hmm.
you don't have the spaces in between, you don't give the brain a chance to separate what is useful and what's not useful. And therefore you're just working on a, like you're talking about the Weber-Fechner law and like the stimulus is too high, you're just working on too high a information set. And the brain needs time to be like, actually, this is not useful. I don't need to stay rigid tension because
Mm-hmm.
I'm not performing in front of a 300 person audience right now. I
Mm-hmm.
can put that down for a little bit. So I think it's a really nice way of like looking at that we need breaks and yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so important. And I know, I mean, it has that societal effect too, where you live and the bubble, the container that you live in. I mean, here in America, my blog post that just went out, or my newsletter to my people that just went out, I talked about this, how, I'm very jealous of Europeans who go on holiday for a month. I mean, we have this Labor Day coming up. That's one day. And let me tell you, this is the first year since opening my office that I'm not working on Labor Day. And here I am telling you all this, and still the container of my society says, well, there's lots of people going to be off on Labor Day that will come in and see you. And so it's this cultural mindset that it's the habit of the culture as well, and the habit of productivity that we all sort of live in. And I think as Americans in particular, we have to kind of push back
Mm,
against our cultural. Even after the pandemic, it was a little bit better. I remember it being really bad before the pandemic, but even now, we are still we're workaholics, and it's in the economic structure of, like, retirement and our healthcare and all of that, like, plays into this
mm,
larger habit of overworking and working ourselves. And I this is one of my core things that I struggle with personally. And it's it's um it's just there. It's just part of our culture, and everything online, everything fast. It's something that we have to, I think, really become much more conscious about.
mm,
Otherwise, I don't know what's going to happen to our brains. I see this a lot with the kids I work now with. I would say 90% of my practice is Feldenkrais and kids with cerebral palsy and other genetic conditions. And I see this in that population too, of this such a deep desire to fix their kiddos, that they go from therapy to therapy to therapy to therapy. So the brain uh, doesn't get the chance to actually absorb anything. And so I try to tell parents, yes, go try this other therapy, but give the brain like 2 weeks at least in between to see, so that you actually can see if anything's making a difference or not. And so it's more apparent to me now that I'm in this population more, but I think you Europeans have it down.
I mean, this goes into a socio-political discussion, and I'd love to have that conversation with you to do with like like the age, the difference in age of our cultures,
Mhm.
like the American culture versus the English culture, and why that might be slightly different for both. But that's going to be
Yeah.
a massive tangent. So
I'm good at tangents, so just reel me back in.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, Erin, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Hopefully people enjoyed it and got a lot from it as well. I feel like it was a rewarding discussion. Um,
Likewise.
if people would like to get in contact with you, what's the best way to do that?
You can email me info@erinfinkelstein.com or soundmovementservices.com. If you can't spell my last name, that's another way to get a hold of me. And I'm on Instagram and Facebook primarily as my social media with
Great.
that same
And
sound.
you teach in Phoenix in person
Yes.
classes?
Yes. And online, I have some programs for musicians and a membership with ATMs that I started during the pandemic. So there's quite a few hundred lessons in there at this point,
Okay.
but primarily in person in Phoenix.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. It's been a pleasure. Maybe we can
Like,
have that socio-political discussion at another point.
I love it. Let's do it.
All right. All right. Thank
You.
you. Bye.